The young woman stood in the doorway as dawn light silhouetted her figure, carrying a pack of belongings and wearing traditional dress that marked her unmistakably as Mohican, her face composed and unreadable as she studied a man who was staring at her with an expression of complete bewilderment. She spoke in careful English, her accent thick, but her words perfectly clear, stating that she was Matoka, daughter of Sachem Ascowedo, and that according to the agreement her father had made 3 days prior, she now belonged to this cabin and to the man who had purchased it. The trader's mind raced frantically through the transaction. He thought he understood. Try to remember any indication that a woman was included in a deal he believed involved only property and land rights. Try and comprehend how he had accidentally acquired a wife when he had only wanted a place to conduct his struggling business. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound as he struggled to formulate a response that would not insult a chief's daughter, while also not accepting an arrangement he had never intended to enter. And in that moment of frozen panic, he understood that his life had just become infinitely more complicated than the simple poverty and failure he had been managing until now. If stories about unexpected complications and the collision of different cultural understandings speak to you, consider subscribing to discover how misunderstandings can create situations that change everything. The autumn of 1744 found the Lake George region in a state of complex coexistence between expanding colonial trading interests and the native peoples who controlled access to the richest fur-bearing territories. Young traders arrived regularly from eastern settlements, hoping to establish themselves in the profitable fur trade that was making fortunes for a few while driving most into debt and disappointment. Competition was fierce, good locations were increasingly scarce, and success required either substantial capital or extraordinary luck that most men simply did not possess. The young man now staring in shock at the woman in his doorway was named Gideon Fletcher, 26 years old, the son of a Philadelphia merchant who had disowned him after a series of business failures that had cost the family significant money and reputation. Gideon had drifted westward with vague plans to redeem himself through success in the frontier trade, believing that hard work and honest dealing would eventually overcome his apparent talent for making poor decisions. 2 years of struggle had taught him that frontier commerce was far more complicated than he had imagined, that success required skills and connections he did not possess, and that honest dealing was often disadvantageous in an environment where deception and exploitation were standard practice. He had been working as an assistant to an established trader, essentially an unpaid apprentice who received minimal compensation and harsh treatment in exchange for learning the business. His master was a brutal man who cheated both native suppliers and colonial buyers with equal enthusiasm, and Gideon had endured 18 months of this arrangement, while saving every scrap of profit and planning his eventual independence. He had managed to accumulate exactly 10 prime beaver pelts, hardly a fortune but enough to potentially purchase basic supplies and establish himself in some marginal location where he could begin building his own operation. 3 days earlier, Gideon had encountered Ascowedo, a Mohican Sachem of considerable influence whose band controlled excellent trapping territories around Lake George. The chief had mentioned, through a translator at the trading post where they met, that he possessed a cabin on prime land that he was willing to sell for the right price. Gideon had expressed interest despite assuming the price would exceed his limited resources, but Ascowedo had surprised him by stating the cabin and associated hunting rights could be purchased for merely 10 beaver pelts, exactly the amount Gideon possessed. The price was so absurdly low that Gideon had immediately suspected some trick or deception. Prime cabins with established hunting rights typically sold for 10 times that amount or more, and chiefs did not generally part with valuable property at bargain rates to unknown white traders. But Ascowedo had insisted the price was firm, had conducted the transaction with elaborate formality that involved ceremonies and spoken agreements Gideon only partially understood, and had handed over a deed of sorts, a marked hide that established Gideon's ownership according to Mohican custom. Gideon had visited the property the following day and found it even better than described. The cabin was well constructed, positioned near excellent water access, and surrounded by forests that showed clear evidence of abundant game. He could hardly believe his extraordinary good fortune, attributing it to finally receiving the lucky break that his years of struggle had earned. He had moved his few possessions into the cabin immediately, spent 2 days organizing and planning his operations, and had been feeling optimistic about his prospects for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. Now, Staring at Matoka as she calmly announced herself as part of the transaction, Gideon felt that familiar sinking sensation that accompanied all his previous disasters. Somehow, despite his best efforts to finally do something right, he had managed to stumble into a situation far more complicated than simple real estate acquisition. He forced himself to speak, his voice coming out higher and more strained than he intended, asking Matoka to explain exactly what she meant by being part of the deal, because he had purchased only a cabin and land rights with no mention of anything else. Matoka regarded him with an expression that might have been amusement or pity, difficult to determine, and explained in her careful English that among her people, a dwelling was not just physical structure, but everything necessary for proper household function. When a man purchased a home with the intention of establishing himself in the territory, it was understood that he required a wife to manage domestic matters, to facilitate relationships with the community, and to create the family structure that gave a man standing and respectability. Her father had included her in the transaction as appropriate provision for a young trader who clearly needed such arrangements to succeed. Gideon felt panic rising in his chest as the full implications became clear. He tried to explain that in his culture, marriage required mutual agreement, courtship, formal ceremonies, and above all the consent of both parties involved. He stated that he had no intention of acquiring a wife, that he was barely capable of supporting himself, let alone a family, and that surely there had been some terrible misunderstanding that could be corrected before it created serious problems. His words tumbled out in a rush, desperation making him less coherent than he needed to be, and he watched Matoka's expression shift from patient explanation to something harder to read. She interrupted his rambling with a raised hand and spoke with quiet firmness that suggested she was not some passive object being delivered without her own thoughts on the matter. She explained that she understood his culture's different customs, that she had learned enough about colonial ways through traders and missionaries to know this arrangement was not typical for his people. But she also stated that the deal had been completed according to Mohican law and custom, that her father's word was binding, and that rejecting her now would be interpreted as a grave insult not just to Escovedo personally, but to the entire band whose honor was invested in proper fulfillment of agreements. Matoka continued, her English improving as she became more comfortable with the conversation. She said that her father was not some ignorant savage disposing of an unwanted daughter, but a shrewd leader making a calculated political decision. By binding a young white trader to his family through marriage, Escovedo created a direct link to colonial trading networks that could benefit his people. By choosing a trader who was struggling and relatively powerless rather than an established merchant, he ensured the relationship would be more balanced than arrangements where wealthy colonists held all the advantages. And by selecting Gideon specifically after observing him at the trading post, her father had identified someone who treated native peoples with basic respect rather than the contempt most settlers displayed. She explained that Gideon's reputation, such as it was, suggested he was honest even when honesty was disadvantageous, that he had refused to participate in his former master's most egregious cheating schemes even though such refusal cost him money, and that he appeared to possess integrity that was rare in a frontier trading environment. These qualities made him suitable for an arrangement that required trust on both sides, that demanded genuine partnership rather than mere economic transaction. Her father was gambling that Gideon's character would make him a reliable ally, and that binding him through marriage would cement that reliability in ways that simple business agreements never could. Gideon listened to this explanation with growing understanding and growing distress. He recognized the political logic even as he recoiled from being manipulated into a situation he had never chosen. He asked Matoka directly what she thought about this arrangement, whether she had been consulted or simply informed after her father made his decision. The question seemed to surprise her, and she was silent for a moment before responding with careful honesty that suggested genuine internal conflict. She said that as the daughter of a sachem, her marriage had always been understood as a political matter rather than purely personal choice. She had known since childhood that her father would arrange a union to serve the band's interests, that her preferences would be considered but were not determinative, and that accepting this reality was part of her responsibility to her people. When Escovedo had informed her 3 days ago that he was including her in the cabin transaction, she had not been shocked by the method, but had been curious about the man who would become her husband through this unconventional arrangement. Matoka admitted she had observed Gideon at the trading post before the transaction occurred, had listened to stories about him from other native traders who had dealt with him, and had formed tentative opinions about his character that were more favorable than she had expected. She stated plainly that her father was going to arrange her marriage regardless of her wishes. Being bound to a struggling young trader who seemed decent was preferable to many other options that might have been chosen. She was 23 years old, past the age when most Mohican women married, and her father's previous attempts to arrange suitable matches had failed for various reasons she did not elaborate on. She told Gideon that she understood he felt trapped and angry about the deception involved in the transaction. She acknowledged that from his perspective, he had been manipulated into an obligation he never intended to accept. But she also stated that from her perspective, he was not the only person whose life had just been dramatically altered without full consent, that she too was navigating an impossible situation, and that they were both caught in circumstances created by her father's political calculations and the complex dynamics between their peoples. Gideon found himself disarmed by Motoka's directness and by the recognition that she was indeed as trapped as he was, perhaps more so given that her culture apparently gave her even less agency in the matter than his culture theoretically gave him. He asked what would happen if he simply refused the arrangement, if he told Ascowito that the deal was void because it had been based on incomplete information. Motoka's response was immediate and sobering. She explained that such refusal would be interpreted as rejecting not just her, but insulting her father's judgment and honor, that it would mark Gideon as untrustworthy and potentially hostile, and that the cabin and land rights would be immediately revoked along with any possibility of trading successfully in territories her father's band controlled. More seriously, she continued, open rejection might prompt violent response from warriors who would view Gideon's insult to their chief's daughter as requiring retribution to restore honor. She stated this matter-of-factly, not as threat, but as simple explanation of cultural realities that Gideon needed to understand. Her father had structured the arrangement so that refusing was far more dangerous than accepting, had created a situation where Gideon's practical options were severely limited regardless of his feelings about the ethics of such manipulation. Gideon sank onto the rough bench that constituted his cabin's only furniture, his mind overwhelmed by the impossible complexity of the situation. He asked Motoka what she expected from this arrangement, what she wanted from a husband she had been assigned to rather than chosen. Her answer revealed depths he had not anticipated. She said that she expected basic respect, honest communication, and genuine effort to make the partnership functional even if neither of them had desired originally. She stated that she would fulfill traditional domestic responsibilities, would help him navigate relationships with her people, and would be a true partner in building whatever life they managed to create together. But she also made clear that she was not some passive object to be owned or controlled. She had her own thoughts, her own skills, her own value that extended beyond mere service to a husband's interests. She expected to be consulted on decisions that affected them both, to have her knowledge and experience valued rather than dismissed, and to be treated as a full human being rather than property her father had transferred. If Gideon could commit to seeing her as a partner rather than a burden or prize, she would commit to making their arrangement work despite its problematic origins. Gideon studied Motoka's face as she spoke, seeing intelligence and strength that demanded acknowledgement regardless of the circumstances that had brought her to his doorway. He realized that rejecting this arrangement would not only endanger him, but would also harm someone who had even less choice in the matter than he did, who was attempting to make the best of the situation imposed upon her by forces beyond her control. The ethical calculation was more complex than simple outrage at being deceived, and he found himself reluctantly admitting that acceptance might be the least harmful option available to either of them. He told Motoka honestly that he had never imagined acquiring a wife this way, that he had significant doubts about his ability to be a good husband when he could barely manage his own affairs, but that he would try to honor the commitment her father had imposed if she was genuinely willing to build something functional from this bizarre beginning. He emphasized that he would need her patience as he learned customs and expectations he did not currently understand, and that he hoped they could approach the arrangement as partners facing a shared challenge rather than as strangers forced into unwanted intimacy. Motoka nodded acceptance of these terms, and something in her posture relaxed slightly, as if she had been prepared for much worse responses than the awkward sincerity Gideon offered. She began unpacking her belongings with efficient movements that suggested she had already decided to commit to making this work regardless of his initial reaction. She brought practical items, cooking implements, and preserved foods and materials for various domestic tasks, but also personal possessions that revealed aspects of her character. books in English that showed she was literate despite many colonist assumptions that natives could not read, tools for craft work that demonstrated skilled trades, and items of obvious sentimental value that indicated a life and identity that existed independent of this arranged marriage. Over the following days, they established routines and boundaries that made cohabitation possible, if not yet comfortable. Matoka took charge of domestic organization with capabilities that far exceeded Gideon's bachelor improvisation, transforming the cabin from a sparse survival shelter into something approaching an actual home. She prepared meals using techniques that stretched their limited supplies further than Gideon had managed. She organized storage and workspace to maximize efficiency, and she brought knowledge of local plants and resources that opened possibilities he had not known existed. Gideon focused on his trading activities, making initial contacts with Mohican hunters who brought furs to exchange for European goods. Having Matoka present changed these interactions dramatically. Traders who had previously been wary or openly suspicious became more relaxed and communicative when they saw Sachem's daughter managing the household, interpreting her presence as validation that Gideon could be trusted. She facilitated negotiations through translation and cultural explanation, helping Gideon avoid offensive mistakes and understand the complex protocols that govern fair dealing in Mohican understanding. He quickly realized that the cabin and prime location meant little without the network of relationships that made trade actually functional. Ascowito had not simply sold property, but had granted access to a web of connections and trust that would have taken Gideon years to develop independently if he ever managed it at all. The marriage to Matoka was a mechanism that made this access legitimate, that transformed him from an outsider to someone with recognized standing in the community. The 10 Beaver Pelts had purchased far more than physical property. They had bought entry into a system that operated on principles of relationship and reciprocity, rather than simple monetary exchange. As weeks passed, Gideon and Matoka developed a partnership that was functional even if not romantic. They maintained separate sleeping arrangements, respecting the fact that neither had chosen this intimacy and that trust needed to be built before more personal connection could develop. They talked extensively during long evenings, Matoka teaching Gideon about Mohican culture and history, while he shared stories about colonial society and his own complicated past. These conversations revealed common ground neither had anticipated, shared experiences of feeling like failures within their respective communities, mutual understanding of what it meant to be caught between worlds and expectations. Matoka explained that she had been considered problematic within her band because she was too outspoken, too interested in learning about European ways, too resistant to the passive domestic role many expected from women. Her intelligence and curiosity were valued by her father, but viewed with suspicion by more traditional community members who worried she was too influenced by foreign ideas. Her unmarried status at 23 had been partially her own resistance to matches that would have required her to diminish herself to accommodate insecure husbands, and Ascowito's arrangement with Gideon had been partly motivated by his daughter's complicated reputation. Gideon shared his own history of failure and disappointment, of never quite meeting his father's expectations, of making mistakes that seemed to follow patterns he could not break. He admitted that part why he had come to the frontier was escape from judgments and comparisons that had made him feel perpetually inadequate. He confessed that accepting this arranged marriage felt like another failure of agency, another situation where he was being carried by forces rather than actively directing his own life, but that perhaps there was value in learning to work within circumstances rather than constantly fighting against them. Their honesty with each other created a foundation that was perhaps more solid than romantic attraction would have provided. They were not lovers but allies, two people who had been thrust together by manipulation, but who chose to make that forced proximity into genuine partnership. Matoka's business acumen proved as sharp as Gideon's willingness to learn, and together they began building a trading operation that was more successful than anything he could have achieved alone. 6 months into their arranged marriage, Ascowito visited to assess how the arrangement was developing. The Sachem observed their interactions with satisfaction, noting the respect they showed each other and the functional partnership they had created. Through Matoka's translation, he explained his reasoning more fully than he had during the original transaction. He told Gideon that he had recognized someone whose character exceeded his circumstances, who possessed integrity that could form the basis for trust between their peoples, and who was young enough to potentially build lasting relationships that would benefit both communities. The sachem acknowledged that his methods had been deceptive, that he had manipulated Gideon into an obligation without full disclosure. But he stated that frontier politics required such calculated maneuvers to protect native interests in an environment where fair dealing from colonists could not be assumed. He had gambled that Gideon's character would make him accept the arrangement once trapped in it, and that Matoka's capabilities would make the partnership valuable enough that resentment would eventually fade into appreciation. He asked directly if his calculations had been correct or if he had misjudged and created a situation that would ultimately fail. Gideon considered Ascowedo's question carefully, aware that his answer would be reported throughout the band and would affect how he was viewed within the community. He responded with honesty that surprised even himself, stating that while he had initially felt manipulated and trapped, he had come to recognize the arrangement's value and to genuinely appreciate Matoka as a partner whose skills and intelligence had transformed a struggling operation into something viable. He acknowledged that he probably would never have agreed to such a marriage if given clear choice beforehand, but that outcomes sometimes matter more than methods, and the outcome here had been far better than his previous trajectory suggested was possible. He also stated, with Matoka translating though he suspected she might soften his words, that he hoped future dealings would involve more transparency, even if he understood the political calculations that had motivated the deception. He said he was committed to honoring the arrangement and to building genuine relationship with Matoka that went beyond mere obligation, and that he hoped Ascowedo would view him as an ally worthy of trust rather than simply a tool to be manipulated for strategic advantage. The sachem listened to this response and nodded with what appeared to be genuine approval. He stated that Gideon's willingness to speak honestly about his feelings while still committing to honor obligations demonstrated exactly the character that had motivated the arrangement. He told Matoka, in her own language first and then in English for Gideon's benefit, that she had been given to a man who would value her properly, and that he was satisfied his daughter would be respected and her talents utilized rather than wasted. Before departing, Ascowedo formally welcomed Gideon into his extended family, granting him status and protection that went far beyond the original property transaction. Over the following year, Gideon and Matoka's partnership deepened into something that resembled genuine affection, though neither rushed to define it precisely. The separate sleeping arrangements gradually gave way to shared space as trust and comfort grew, and physical intimacy developed naturally rather than as imposed obligation. They maintained their functional division of labor, while also supporting each other in ways that went beyond simple partnership, creating a relationship that was uniquely theirs rather than conforming to either culture's standard expectations for marriage. Their trading operation prospered as Gideon's network of native suppliers expanded through Matoka's connections and his own growing reputation for fair dealing. He learned to navigate the complex protocols of frontier commerce, understanding that relationships and reciprocity mattered more than simple profit maximization, that long-term success required building trust rather than exploiting temporary advantages. Matoka's presence legitimized him in ways that would have been impossible for a lone white trader, and her business judgment prevented mistakes that his inexperience might have produced. They faced challenges from both communities. Some Mohicans viewed Matoka's marriage to a colonist as betrayal or as Ascowedo selling his daughter to secure trading advantages. Some white traders and settlers regarded Gideon with suspicion, questioning his loyalty and suggesting he had abandoned his own people for native sympathies. The couple learned to navigate these criticisms by maintaining clear principles, dealing honestly with everyone regardless of background, and refusing to be drawn into the violent conflicts that periodically erupted along the frontier. When Matoka became pregnant in their second year together, the reality of their situation shifted in profound ways. They were no longer just partners managing a trading post, but were creating family that would embody the connection between their peoples. Gideon felt unexpected joy at the prospect of fatherhood, emotion he had not anticipated given the arranged nature of their union. And Matoka's happiness suggested she had found contentment in circumstances that had initially seemed like exile or punishment. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1747, delivered with assistance from Mohican women, who brought traditional knowledge and support that made Gideon grateful for his wife's connections. They named her Sarah after Gideon's mother, with a Mohican name as well that honored Matoka's heritage. The child represented hope that bridges between cultures were possible, that the next generation might navigate the complicated frontier with more grace than their parents' generation had managed. As years passed and their family grew, Gideon often reflected on that autumn morning when Matoka had appeared in his doorway announcing herself as part of a deal he had not understood. The arrangement that had seemed like disaster had transformed his life in ways he could never have predicted or planned. The 10 beaver pelts he had paid for a cabin had purchased entry into a world far richer than simple property acquisition, had connected him to community and purpose and relationship that gave his life meaning beyond the struggle for survival and profit that had previously defined his existence. Matoka sometimes spoke about her own journey from being her father's political instrument to being a woman who had claimed agency within an arrangement imposed upon her. She stated that while she would never endorse the methods Escovedo had used, she could not regret outcomes that had given her a partnership based on mutual respect rather than the traditional dominance many marriages in both their cultures involved. She had shaped their relationship into something that honored her intelligence and capabilities, had refused to be diminished by the fact that she had been included in a property transaction, and had insisted on being treated as full partner rather than mere appendage to her husband's enterprise. Their trading post became known throughout the region as a place where fair dealing could be expected, where cultural misunderstandings were patiently explained rather than exploited, where both native and colonial customers were treated with equal respect. Gideon and Matoka trained their children to move between both worlds, teaching them English and Mohican, European and native customs, preparing them for lives that would require navigating complex identities in an environment that increasingly demanded people choose absolute loyalty to one side or the other. When Escovedo died in his 70s, respected elder whose long leadership had guided his band through devastating changes, Gideon attended the funeral ceremonies with his family and felt genuine grief for a man who had manipulated him into an arranged marriage. He understood, with the clarity that years of maturity provided, that the Sachem had been trying to secure whatever advantages he could for his people in a world that was systematically destroying indigenous communities, and that binding a white trader to marriage to his daughter had been a calculated gamble that might provide some protection or benefit as colonial pressure intensified. Matoka mourned her father as the complicated figure he had been, loving parent who had also used her as political instrument, shrewd leader who had secured her future while denying her choice, man who had valued her capabilities but within frameworks that limited her autonomy. She told Gideon that she had made peace with the contradiction, that she could honor her father's memory, while also acknowledging the problematic aspects of how he had exercised his power, and that perhaps the best legacy she could offer was building a life that transcended the limitations both their cultures tried to impose. As Gideon aged and looked back on his unlikely journey from failed Philadelphia merchant to respected frontier trader, he recognized that the 10 beaver pelts he had spent so carefully had been the best investment in his life, not because of the property acquired, but because of the relationship that had been forced upon him, and that he had chosen to honor rather than reject. The cabin had been valuable, but Matoka's partnership had been priceless, transforming his trajectory from continued failure to genuine success measured not just in profits, but in family and community and purpose. Their children, and eventually grandchildren, carried forward the complicated legacy of their union, embodying both the possibility and the tension of lives lived between cultures. Some chose to identify more with their native heritage, some more with their European background, but all carried the understanding that their existence proved bridges could be built even when the methods that created those bridges were ethically questionable and the forces trying to destroy such connections were overwhelmingly powerful. In his final years, when Gideon was himself an elder whose long life had witnessed massive changes in the frontier region, he would tell the story of his arranged marriage to anyone interested in hearing it. He emphasized the deception involved, refusing to romanticize the manipulation that had trapped both him and Matoka in an obligation neither had chosen. But he also insisted that outcomes mattered, that relationships built on initial coercion could transform into genuine partnerships if both people chose honor over resentment, and that some of life's greatest gifts came wrapped in circumstances that initially seemed like disasters. Matoka, sitting beside him during these retellings, would sometimes add her own perspective, reminding listeners that being traded as part of a property deal was degrading regardless of positive outcomes, that her father's methods should not be celebrated even if his intentions were protective, but that she had claimed her own agency within the situation by insisting on respect and partnership rather than accepting a subordinate role. She stated that women in both their cultures deserve better than being bargained away without consent, and that the next generation should build on connections her marriage represented while rejecting the patriarchal assumptions that had made such arrangements possible. Thank you so much for watching this complex story about arranged marriage, cultural collision, and how relationships can transform from manipulation into genuine partnership when both people choose to honor their commitments with integrity and respect. If this tale resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to never miss another story about the complicated realities of frontier life and the bridges built between different worlds. Give this video a thumbs up if you appreciate stories that don't shy away from ethical complexity, that acknowledge both the problems and possibilities in difficult situations. Share this story with someone who understands that life rarely offers perfect choices, that sometimes we must work within circumstances we didn't create, and that character is defined by how we respond to situations rather than by the situations themselves. Leave a comment telling us about times when arrangements you initially resented became valuable in unexpected ways, or about relationships that started poorly but transformed into something meaningful through commitment and mutual respect. Your stories create community among people who understand that real life is complicated, that good outcomes don't erase problematic beginnings, and that we can honor both the value of what we built and the legitimate criticisms of how those foundations were laid. Until next time, remember that partnerships require active choice even when circumstances are imposed, that respect must be insisted upon rather than assumed, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections emerge in the most unlikely and uncomfortable beginnings when both people commit to seeing each other fully and building something authentic together.